Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today. Every single time you buy a new smartphone, sip that morning cup of coffee, or fill up your car with gas, you're actually tapping into this massive, highly synchronized global network. Today, we're mapping out the invisible global highways that connect absolutely everything we buy. It is just a fascinating journey through geography, history, and economics.
Okay, let's dive into this. You'd probably think we live in the age of cargo planes and high-speed freight trains, right? But get this, a staggering 90% of global trade travels by sea. Yeah, 90%. Those massive floating container ships are literally the lifelines of our global economy. What happens out there on the water directly and immediately impacts what comes right out of your wallet at the grocery store.
To really understand the anatomy of globalization, we've broken it down into four key areas today. First up, a brief history of trade. Then, the ocean's strategic choke points. Third, the fragile supply chain. And finally, the future of trade.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, a brief history of trade. Because to understand our highly complex modern network, we need a rapid-fire look at how this system was actually built from the ground up. We're starting way back around 1800 BC with the incense route, where simple caravans carried luxury goods across the desert. Then, jumping to 1390 BC, the legendary Silk Road opens up, finally connecting China to the west. Fast forward to 1494, and Spain and Portugal literally draw a line on a map to divide the newly discovered world with the Tordesillas meridian. And then, by 1869, human engineering hits a totally new peak with the inauguration of the Suez Canal, which suddenly cut a massive 6-month sailing journey down to just 60 days.
However, we absolutely have to acknowledge the darker realities of how these routes were established. It's a tough history. Over a 200-year period, estimates show that between 7 and 20 million Africans were subjected to the horrific triangular slave trade to work on new global plantations. Furthermore, colonization led to the systematic plundering of resources across Africa and the Americas. And this shadow economy, it hasn't entirely disappeared. Even today, a clandestine trade in arms and drugs generates an estimated $500 billion annually.
Moving into the modern era, the Industrial Revolution completely flipped the script. The mechanization of textiles created this insatiable demand for raw materials like cotton. And crucially, we traded in our sails for steamships. Suddenly, the world just shrank. Moving massive quantities of iron, textiles, and everyday goods across the oceans became faster and cheaper than humanity had ever seen, basically supercharging the push toward the globalization we know today. All right, moving right along to Section 2, the ocean's strategic choke points. We're going to zoom in on the vital, narrow geographical bottlenecks that pretty much control the fate of global commerce. I absolutely love this metaphor from our source material. It says, if the global economy is a living body, these maritime choke points are its main arteries and critical valves. They aren't just narrow strips of water on a map. They are the actual pulse points of energy security and global wealth. Simply put, if one valve gets squeezed, the whole body feels the pain.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is a classic geographical trap. If you hear the name Palk Strait, your brain probably instantly goes, Pakistan, right? Examiners love using this psychological trick on geography tests. But the reality is, it has absolutely nothing to do with Pakistan. It strictly connects India's Tamil Nadu state to Sri Lanka's Mannar district. Definitely a crucial piece of South Asian geography to keep in mind.
Heading east, we hit the Strait of Malacca, wedged incredibly tightly between Indonesia and Malaysia. This is arguably the busiest maritime route in the world, connecting the Andaman Sea to the South China Sea. Why is it so packed? Well, it's the shortest, most direct route between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. If this strait ever had to close, ships would have to detour thousands of kilometers around other Indonesian islands. And that means massive fuel costs, huge delays, and instant extreme inflation for the everyday goods we buy.
1/3. Let that sink in for a second. 1/3 of all the maritime oil transported in the entire world passes through just one incredibly narrow, highly sensitive passageway. And that passageway is the Strait of Hormuz, located right between Oman and Iran. Honestly, think of this strait as the main valve of the world's petrol pump, because so many Middle Eastern oil-producing nations rely entirely on this single exit to export their crude oil. Any geopolitical tension, military exercise, or conflict here immediately spikes the price you pay your local gas pump. It's just a stark reminder of our global energy dependency.
As ships carry that oil westward, they hit Bab el-Mandeb, separating Yemen and Djibouti. The name translates from Arabic to Gate of Tears. And wow, that is not just a dramatic nickname. It's a grim historical reality.
The combination of terrifyingly complex currents, unpredictable winds, and deadly hidden rocks caused so many tragic shipwrecks over the centuries that the families of lost sailors literally named it after their own weeping.
Once ships manage to survive the Red Sea, they enter the incredible Suez Canal. And this brilliantly illustrates a really common geographical mix-up. On the northern end, opening to the Mediterranean, sits Port Said. On the southern end, where the canal begins from the Red Sea, is Port Suez. Getting that distinction right is key. This artificial waterway is a total game-changer, single-handedly cutting out a brutal 7,000-kilometer journey around the entire continent of Africa.
Once they're through the Suez, ships are sailing the Mediterranean. But to get out to the vast Atlantic Ocean, they have to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, separating Spain and Europe from Morocco and Africa. It's aptly called the key to the Mediterranean because, well, it is the absolute only natural exit out. Whoever strategically controls this narrow little gap functionally controls the navigation and trade of the entire Mediterranean Sea.
Now, jumping across the Atlantic, we find the ultimate engineering cheat code, the Panama Canal. Carved directly through the Isthmus of Panama, it seamlessly connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Before this marvel existed, a ship traveling from New York to California had to sail all the way down and around the freezing, dangerous, storm-battered southern tip of South America. The Panama Canal essentially shrank the Western Hemisphere for international trade.
Which brings us to Section 3, the fragile supply chain. Because while this heavily interconnected system is brilliant, it is also terrifyingly vulnerable.
Let's walk through the domino effect here. Step 1, a disruption hits literally any of the choke points we just talked about. Step 2, ships are immediately forced to reroute. This adds thousands of miles to their journey, which burns millions of dollars in excess fuels and causes weeks of delays. Step 3, because those logistics costs get passed directly onto us, the consumers, prices at your local grocery store and gas station skyrocket globally. It's a complete chain reaction.
So what exactly are the modern threats squeezing these arteries? First up, geopolitical tensions and military conflicts, like the ones we see in the South China Sea or the Red Sea. Second, piracy and theft remain a very real, very present danger, particularly around the Horn of Africa. And third, severe climate disruptions. Prolonged droughts can dangerously lower the water levels in artificial canals, while severe storms can wipe out vital port infrastructure literally overnight.
And that leads us to our final segment, Section 4, the future of trade. With all these vulnerabilities in mind, it's really important to realize the map we've been looking at isn't static. It's actively changing.
A major factor driving this is China's Belt and Road Initiative. Launched back in 2013, its objective is to heavily secure raw material supply lines and massively boost Chinese exports. By financing and constructing roads, transcontinental railroads, and huge seaports all over the world, China aims to physically and economically connect Asia, Africa, and Europe by the year 2049, which just so happens to be the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic.
But honestly, perhaps the most dramatic geographical shift is happening right at the top of the world. Climate change and the melting of the North Pole's ice are actively opening up entirely new, significantly shorter Arctic maritime routes. For massive shipping companies, this is monumental. A shorter route means massive fuel savings, and crucially, it allows them to completely bypass those hefty taxes levied by the Suez and Panama Canals.
So the crucial point is that global powers are fiercely strategizing over this emerging icy frontier as we speak. The United States and the European Union are steadfastly demanding completely free and open navigation. Meanwhile, China has clear intentions to develop what they call a polar Silk Road. And naturally, due to their massive northern coastlines, both Russia and Canada are geographically poised to benefit heavily from controlling these new, incredibly valuable waters.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves today. The global highways have shifted from the ancient Silk Road to the modern Suez Canal, and now they're pointing toward the melting Arctic. As the ice clears and these incredibly lucrative new paths open up, who will actually control the trade routes of tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I will see you next time.